Welcome to the CEC Gurukul live lecture series on Introduction to Indian Philosophy, and today's topic is Charvaka School of Indian Philosophy. The Charvaka is the materialist school of thought which faced considerable ridicule by other schools of Indian philosophy because of its controversial and disputable claims. But as philosophy is about giving way to any system of thought that is consistent in its assertions, protests, concerns, and redressals, Charvaka remained an important and ineluctable philosophical thought. In India, philosophy has ever remained in its search for finding answers regarding the ultimate nature of reality, and for devising or realizing practical methods to know these answers. There were three main issues which kept the Indian philosophers engaged. These were, number one, the law of karma, which states that as long as a person is alive, he performs actions, and these actions give rise to results which are either good or bad, for him or for others or for the society as a whole. Now, in order to reap the fruits of his actions of his present or previous lives, the person has to again take birth in order to enjoy the pleasures resulting from his good actions or to suffer the pains because of his past wrongdoings. And number two is the cycle of birth and death, and the third is liberation or release from the cycle of birth and death. And we see that different schools of Indian philosophy have given answers to these questions in consonance with their scheme of thought. We discussed earlier in the first lecture that there is a division in Indian philosophical schools into heterodox, that is Nastika, and orthodox, that is Astika traditions, in view of the rejection or acceptance of the authority of the Vedas. The orthodox schools in totality are spiritual in nature, and therefore they tackle these three issues conforming to the Vedic recommendations. However, they do maintain their distinctness and uniqueness while adhering to the Vedic teachings. Among the heterodox schools comprising of Jainism, Buddhism and Charvaka, it is only the Charvaka that is not concerned with these three philosophical issues, and they have been labeled as crude and vulgar hedonists for completely rejecting the concepts of soul, afterlife and liberation. This makes the Charvakas interesting. Imagine they survived despite the anger, disdain and rejection not only of their contemporary philosophical schools, but even after of its fizzling out as a result of not having any successors to keep the tradition running. Let us now investigate the Charvaka system of thought and understand how and why did it emerge. Who were the preceptors of this system? What were their beliefs? And why the other philosophical systems were so much against them? Now let us begin with the history and origin of Charvaka. This materialistic atheistic school has been denounced as Dhut since its formal inception and its unceremonious disappearance. It is believed that when the Pandavas returned to Hastinapur after winning the great battle, they were greeted by thousands of Brahmins who showered their blessings on them. But there was a Charvaka in that assembly who vociferously rebuked all, and especially the king Yudhishthira, for killing and murdering his own relatives. All in the assembly were shocked to hear these words. Yudhishthira felt so morally disturbed that he desired death for himself at that very moment. However, the Brahmins, on regaining their stability of their mind, told Yudhishthira that he should not get distraught or upset by the words of a Dhut, a demon in disguise. And then that Charvaka was punished and set on fire. As you all know, the battle of Kurukshetra was not fought for any personal gains, and that the Kauravas and others were killed because they were on the side of adharma. So, all that the Charvakas said was unreasonable and unwarranted. But this episode assures us that the Charvakas were a courageous, uninhibited, vociferous, and radical group of people. We must admit that materialism is as old as philosophy is. While Greeks were searching for a material cause of the world, here in India, its roots were taking shape, perhaps unintendedly, in the Vedic literature. I can give you some examples. There is a hymn in the Rig Veda to the effect that being came from non-being, which amounts to the same as matter is the ultimate reality. Also, remember the story of Prajapati, Indra and Virochana in the Chandogya Upanishad, where Prajapati in the beginning tells Indra and Virochana that body is the same as the self? The Katha Upanishad also makes a reference to those who doubt the existence of self after death. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad also, we find Yajnavalkya explaining to Maitri, his wife, the view of those who think that consciousness is produced when the four elements, earth, water, fire and air, come together in a peculiar combination. And consciousness disappears when this peculiar combination disintegrates, and that is the death of the person. We should not assume from this that these were the teachings of the Vedas or the Upanishads. What we need to understand is that there existed people who believed in such doctrines and wanted to stick to them. They were the skeptics, the agnostics, or the materialists. In a nutshell, they were anti-spiritualists. Now, a question that troubles modern philosophers is regarding the time when this materialist school of thought emerged as a philosophic tradition. Some are of the opinion that it is the oldest school of thought. The reason being that all the other schools of thought have unfailingly refuted the views of this system. Some of these philosophers go on to the extent of considering materialism as the only authentic system of thought in ancient India. Other schools emerged with the sole mission of criticizing and demolishing it. There is one more reason which I find very interesting, is that philosophy means darshana and darshana means to see. Charvaka or materialism is the only school of thought which recognizes perception as the only means of knowing. Thus, it is because of the Charvaka school that philosophy came to be translated as Darshan Shastra, and every other school acknowledged this by accepting this label. Is this not interesting? Now, the other group of philosophers maintains that materialism is as old as the other schools of Indian philosophy, and it cannot be older as it has criticized the dogmatic and orthodox doctrines of other systems. But one thing that all clearly state is that there is nothing constructive in the system. The Charvaka system developed only with the purpose of refuting the existing theories. So basically, they do not have anything positive to offer to the world. But indeed, it is a great accomplishment for a system like Charvaka to make a mark on the rich, diversified philosophical fabric of India, despite not having any compendium or work manual for adherence and reference. From the various works of other systems, we can infer that at least there were two books that contained the doctrines of Indian materialism, which of course are lost now. These were Barhaspatya Sutra and Lokayata Shastra. Most probably there was also a commentary on the Lokayata Shastra. Anyway, according to the tradition, Brihaspati is regarded as the founder of the materialist school. As to who he was, there is no conclusive answer. Some are of the opinion that he was the teacher of gods. Apart from Brihaspati, there are other names also associated with the materialist school, like Ajit Kesha Kambalin, Charvaka and Purandara, who have contributed heavily to the sustenance of this system. Now, many reasons can be given for why this system emerged. Some say that it emerged as a protest movement against the extreme dogmatism of the priestly class. The ritualistic practices and the idealistic teachings of the Upanishads were of no use to the common man. The ill treatment of the masses by the rulers, priests, and the wealthy created a social and political crisis in those distant times. This discontentment among people gave rise to the materialistic way of thinking, which advocated enjoyment of pleasure born out of senses and gratification of desires. And this is so evident from their cool and fashionable slogan, which is Yavat Jiveta Sukham Jived Rinam Kritva Ghritam Pivet Bhasmi Bhutasya Dehasya Punaragamanam Kuta. What life is yours? Live joyously. None can escape death's searching eye. When once this frame of ours they burn, how shall it ever return again? Charvaka, after whom the system got its name, was the chief disciple of Brihaspati. Some are of the opinion that Charvaka himself was the founder of the system, while some others believe that the word Charvaka signifies a person who believes in eat, drink and be merry, as the root charva means to eat. According to another interpretation, the word Charvaka means a person who is sweet-tongued and eats up his own words and thus has no regard for morality. Lokayata, which is another name of this school, refers to the masses or commoners, and so it is believed that the system belonged to those of low and unrefined taste. As there are no original works of the system available, we depend for our knowledge of this system on Sarva Darshana Samgraha of Madhavacharya, Tattvopaplava Simha of Jayarashi Bhatt, and Nataka Prabodha Chandroday of Krishna Mishra. Of course, along with the Puranas and the works of other schools of Indian philosophy. Now, Dakshina Ranjan Shastri, in his book The History of Indian Materialism, Sensationalism and Hedonism, has quite elaborately discussed the evolution of the materialistic thought in India. According to him, there were 4 stages of development of Indian materialism. The first stage was the stage of opposition and was called Barhaspatya. In this stage, knowledge in all forms and the authority of the Vedas was called into question. In the second stage, the system got some structure. Perception was recognized as a source of knowledge, and the theory of Swabhavavad, according to which nature exists and sustains by itself without the need of any supernatural agency to propel or move it. This was accepted. And the theory of identity of the body with the self was also accepted. And this was the period of the materialist thinker Ajita Keshav Kambalin. Now, the modern writers have labeled this stage as hedonism. For now, it began preaching, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die." But this wicked and corrupt thought was providing them with huge criticisms. It was proving to be quite destructive for the system to sustain. So, a mild form of spiritualism was introduced in the third stage, and a slight change in the notion of self was incorporated. Now, the self was identified with the sense organs and the organs of thought. Probability and inference as sources of knowledge were also accepted, though in a limited sense. The materialist philosopher Purandara was associated with this period of development. In the fourth stage, along with the Buddhists and the Jainas, the materialist school got the title Nastika for condemning the Vedic teachings and rejecting their authority. Now let us come to the basic tenets of the Charvaka system. Now, the Charvaka school, have been the characteristic philosophy of this system have been inferred only through the existing aphorisms of Brihaspati, as these aphorisms have been quoted for purposes of rejection or criticisms by other schools of Indian thought. So, we have only fragments of the system available. However, all that can be gathered from these aphorisms is the following. Now, the first is earth, water, fire and air are the only elements. The organisms, sense organs and the objects are the result of different combinations of these four elements. Consciousness arises out of these elements like the intoxicating ability arising out of quinoa seeds when fermented. The physical body endowed with consciousness is called Purusha, the soul. The jivas or the empirical selves perish, just as the bubbles over water perish. There is no other world, and there does not exist anyone in any other world. Death itself is liberation. The three Vedas, Rig Veda, Sama Veda and Yajur Veda, are like the inconsequential chatter of the cunning and crafty persons insofar as the experience of pleasure in Swarga is concerned. Material welfare and the gratification of one's usual day-to-day desires are the two aims of life. Politics, including agriculture, is the only perfect science. Perception is the only source of knowledge. The approach, direction, or method aspired by common men must be followed. Let us understand what they are up to in all these assertions. We can see, as it is evident from the assertions, that Charvakas were advocating quite radical and unrestrained views. There are many stories and episodes present in the Vedas, Upanishads and the Puranas which make this system more enigmatic. Let me narrate some. In ancient times, there were constant fights between the gods and the demons. To make the situation worse for the gods, the demons also started practicing strict austerities prescribed in the Vedas. And this became a cause of worry for Indra, the king of gods. So, at his invocation, Maya Moha was created, who, as a teacher to the demons, preached the corrupt and wicked doctrines of Brihaspati for the purpose of their destruction. And as soon as they gave up their austerities and became hostile towards the Vedic injunctions, Indra defeated them. But there is another version of this story in the Maitrayani Upanishad. Here, Brihaspati himself is in the role of the savior of Indra. According to this one, Brihaspati, in order to save Indra from the demons, assumed the form of Shukra, the teacher of the demons, so that he could impart false knowledge to them. And he did it by reversing their concepts of good and evil. As a result, the demons developed aversion towards the Vedic teachings, and Indra easily defeated them. And in the Taittiriya Brahmana, there is an episode in which Brihaspati hit goddess Gayatri on her head, as a result of which her head and brain broke into pieces. Being immortal, she did not die, and every bit of her brain remained alive. Now, this episode is interesting because it has an allegorical significance. Goddess Gayatri represents religion. Brihaspati, by hitting on her head, tried to demolish Vedic religion by advancing a counter thought. But as Vedas are eternal, he failed drastically. Now, coming back to the aphorisms, the entire philosophy of Charvaka springs from these aphorisms, whether it is epistemology, metaphysics, or ethics. Let us see what their epistemology is about. The Charvakas were upholders of a kind of rigorous empiricism. They regarded pratyaksha or perception as the only pramana or source of knowledge, and they did not believe in anything that was beyond the region of perception. Anything that was not perceived did not exist. Their acceptance of perception only led them to reject, number one, the principle of causation. In causation, cause and effect are two events which stand by themselves, solitary and unrelated. On what grounds can one prove that the two are related? To determine whether a given thing or event precedes another as its cause, we need to be certain of the universal and invariable relation between the two. But can we ever guarantee any such universal and invariable relation between two things or events? How can such a relation be perceived? We know causal relations in terms of universal propositions, but how can we make such universal claims of causal relations as they cannot be supported by perception? Perception means actual contact of the sense organs with the objects. This means perception concerns only with the present. Universal propositions make big claims which include not just the present but also the past and the future. So, if perception is the only source of knowledge, then there can be no place for the law of causation. And the second thing that they reject is anuman or inference as a source of knowledge. Inference is based on universal and invariable relation between two things or events, which is called vyapti, and thereby making universal claims or propositions about them. If you remember, the Charvakas did accept probability and a mild or a weak version of inference. Probability or sambhavana means that which is not directly perceived, it may exist, but we cannot be certain about it. Inference or anumana is based on vyapti or universal and invariable relation, but it is impossible to have an infallible vyapti. Therefore, the belief in the existence of fire on the hill because of the perception of smoke there can be true only insofar as it is indirectly based on direct perception. Someone may have perceived smoke accompanying fire, but it could very well be a case of falsity also. Universal propositions sometimes turn out to be true accidentally. But is that a good reason to accept all unperceived cases as true? Inductive inference leads us from something known to something that is unknown. How can we rely on that? Similarly, deductive inference is circular in nature, as the conclusion is already contained in the major premise, making a universal claim, which itself is unprovable and therefore of no use. So, perception is the only source of knowledge and inference stands redundant. The Charvakas have been severely criticized on this by the other schools of Indian philosophy. The Charvakas make the assertion that perception is the valid source of knowledge, while inference is an invalid source of knowledge. Now the opponents ask, is this claim not a result of an inference? They perhaps made this claim after having several experiences to prove this, which clearly suggests that their claim that perception is the only reliable source of knowledge is arrived at by inference, which creates quite a troublesome position for the Charvakas. Now, by rejecting inference, the Charvakas are blocking all the ways that lead to discussions, speculations, hypotheses, theories, proofs and disproofs. Thoughts, ideas and understanding are not material in nature. They cannot therefore be perceived, but they can only be inferred. In fact, it is because of inference that Charvakas understand others and others understand them. And that is why the other schools of Indian philosophy regard the Charvaka take on inference as absurd and nonsensical. And there are examples corroborating their criticism of the Charvaka position. I'll give two. One, the earth looks flat, but it is not. How do we know this? Of course, not through perception. And second, the sun appears like a small disk, but is it so? No, it is much bigger than the earth. So, we cannot depend on perception alone. And the third thing that they reject is Shabda or testimony as a source of knowledge. Shabda is that source of knowledge which is based on the testimony of those people who are considered honest and trustworthy. And so, the knowledge that is gained is true. The Charvaka question testimony on the following grounds. 1. How are we supposed to ascertain the honesty or trustworthiness of a person? We do that by inference, by relying on the instances where a person has proved himself to be honest and trustworthy. But how can we at the same time ignore the fact that what appears may not be the actual case? In the sense, many a time what is reliable turns out to be unreliable. Second, how does one establish the truth of the testimony of a person? Is it by another testimony? If yes, then how does one establish the truth of the second testimony? By the third testimony. And how does one establish the third testimony? By the fourth. and it leads us into an infinite regress. And the only way to break this chain is to bring in direct experience. So, ultimately, Shabda or testimony becomes redundant, and again, perception is established as the only reliable pramana by the Charvakas. And the fourth thing they reject is ether or akasha as the fifth element. Ether cannot be known by perception. So, the atomic particles of the elements earth, water, fire and air alone give rise to the different organisms when they combine in different proportions. Now, let us discuss the Charvaka metaphysics now. And the Sarva Darshan Sangraha consolidates the teachings of Brihaspati in the following words. There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world, nor do the actions of the four castes, orders, etc. produce any real effect. The Agnihotra, the three Vedas, the ascetics, three staves, and smearing oneself with ashes were made by nature as the livelihood of those destitute of knowledge and manliness. If a beast slain in the Jyotishtoma rite will itself go to heaven, why then does not the sacrificer forthwith offer his own father? If the Shraddha produces gratification to beings who are dead, then here too, in the case of travelers, when they start, it is needless to give provisions for the journey. If beings in heaven are gratified by our offering the Shraddha here, then why not give the food down below to those who are standing on the housetop? While life remains, let a man live happily. Let him feed on ghee, even though he runs in debt. When once the body becomes ashes, how can it ever return again? If he who departs from the body goes to another world, how is it that he comes not back again, restless for love of his kindred? Hence, it is only as a means of livelihood that Brahmins have established here all these ceremonies for the dead. There is no other fruit anywhere. The three authors of the Vedas were buffoons, knaves, and demons. All the well-known formulas of the Pandits and all the obscene rites for the queen commanded in the Ashwamedha were invented by buffoons, and so all the various kinds of presents to the priests while the eating of flesh was similarly commanded by night-prowling demons. This was Brihaspati. Now, the Charvakas were naturalists, as they explained everything in terms of the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air. They denounced spiritualism in all its forms. The ideas of God, soul, heaven, and hell seemed quite absurd to the Charvakas, as nothing beyond these four elements and their combinations had any reality. It is important to note here that the Charvakas were divided into two schools: the Dhurta, or those who categorically denied the existence of soul, and Sushikshita, who accepted the existence of soul as long as the body existed. The Sushikshita were further divided into four groups. The first group believed in Dehatmavada, that is, the soul is to be identified with the body. The second group insisted on Indriyatmavad, that is, the soul is to be identified with the sense organs. The third group maintained Pranatmavad, according to which the soul is to be identified with the vital breath. And the last group believed in Manoatmavad, that is, the soul is to be identified with the mind. Now, those believing in Dehatmavad were subdivided into three groups. One group identified the soul with the gross body, and for that reason they were still called Dehatmavadins. The second group identified the soul with the subtle body and were called Sukshma Dashatmavadins. And the third group identified the soul with the causal body and were called Antahkaranatmavadins. In any case, consciousness or life or intelligence or soul is nothing but a byproduct of matter. It is a particular combination of the four elements. Matter secretes mind as liver secretes bile. And when this particular combination of elements disintegrates, the consciousness vanishes, the body dies. There is nothing immaterial or spiritual about it. The Charvakas say, Jadabhuta vikareshu chaitanyam yattu drishyate tambula puga churnanam yogadraga evottita. Meaning, intelligence or consciousness which is found to be embodied in modified forms of non-intelligent or unconscious elements is produced in the same way in which red color is produced from the combination of betel, areca nut and lime. Soul or consciousness is the only living principle in all living organisms. It makes the organism see, smell, hear, feel, remember and think. The expressions like I am fat or I have a headache refer to the body, for it is the body which is fat or has pain. Those suggesting the existence of soul apart from the body are talking only in terms of metaphors. The Shrutis have misguided innocent men by inducing in them the false belief that the soul is different from the body. Just as a cheater or fraudster tricks an innocent man by giving him glass in exchange of precious stones, so has the Veda displaced a person's belief system. The Charvaka, in the similar tenor, denounced the concepts of God, rebirth, and moksha. According to them, Vedas are nothing but confused and illogical blabbering of fraudsters who use them as their means of livelihood. There is no such notion of karma in the Charvaka system, as it presumes a mysterious agency called fate, which rewards or punishes the person in his next life according to the merits or demerits he acquires in his previous life. For them, a person is rewarded or punished in this very life in accordance with his svabhava. Religion for them is the biggest evil. It is the invention of those who wish to deceive their fellow beings for their own self-interest. Prayers are done by those who are weak and do not have willpower. The priests are the biggest liars. They fool the innocent men to earn their living. Heaven and hell are not recognized by them, for nothing supernatural exists. Heaven is just another name for prosperity, and hell refers to the mundane troubles experienced by people. It means endurance of pain. God is no other than the earthly monarch or king, whose existence can be proved by perception and who alone can judge the right and wrong in the society. And now we can easily infer their view on moksha or final liberation. It is just the destruction of the self. It has been objected by some that if consciousness is to be identified with the body, then how does one differentiate between the human conscious body and the animal conscious body? There definitely is a difference, for animals are not rational creatures. The Charvakas answer this objection by stating that it is due to a particular combination of the four elements that the human body produces, the rational consciousness, and it is inseparable from the human body. But there are definitely serious objections against the Charvaka view of consciousness, and I'll discuss a few. One objection is that in swoons, epilepsy, and dreamless sleep, the body remains alive without consciousness. Also, in dreams, consciousness is seen without the body. And when the dreamer wakes up, he realizes the falsity of the dream body, but acknowledges the dream consciousness. For the objects in the dream are unreal, but the person who saw those objects in the dream cannot be denied. This is because consciousness continues to exist in all the states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. The fact that consciousness is not experienced without the material body does not prove that it is produced out of matter. Mere coexistence is not causation. The two horns of a bull, for example, are always together, but does that mean they are causally related? Another interesting criticism against the Charvaka is that if consciousness is a property of the body, then like other properties of the body, it must also be perceived. But can we do that? Can we perceive consciousness as a property? We neither see it, nor smell it, nor hear it, nor taste it, nor touch it. So what kind of a property is it? And the opponents say, if the existence of consciousness or soul cannot be proved after the death of the individual, then its non-existence too cannot be demonstrated. Now let us come to the Charvaka ethics. As I have already discussed, Charvakas were out and out pleasure seekers. If we borrow the Western terminology, we can unhesitatingly label them as hedonists. Eat, drink, and be merry, as was their motto, their only slogan. In fact, their ethics developed out of their rejection of the Vedic scriptures, and thus from the prevalent notions of God, afterlife, heaven, and liberation. The Vedas declare 4 goals for men, which are called Purusharthas, namely Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Dharma is the regulatory principle. It instructs or guides the individual how to lead a moralistic life. Artha stands for wealth or other resources which one requires to lead a comfortable life. Kama signifies pleasure or satisfaction of desires. And moksha, which is considered as the final end, means liberation from the cycle of birth and death. And no prizes for guessing what the Charvakas would choose out of these. Of course, Artha and Kama. Artha or wealth is the means to realize the ultimate end, which is Kama or pleasure or desire fulfillment. And how one accumulates wealth, that was not a relevant matter for the Charvakas. So, even the foul means for accumulating wealth were sanctioned by them for the pursuance of pleasure. The Vedic scriptures say that one must be careful while choosing pleasures, because generally pleasures arising from contact of sensible objects are accompanied by pain. The Charvakas found this reasoning quite foolish and they discarded it, saying the berries of paddy, rich with finest white grains, what man, seeking his true interest, would fling away because they are covered with husk and dust? What they mean is that pleasures, no doubt, are mixed up with pain, but that is no reason to relinquish them. Nobody stops cooking in view of an approaching beggar. Further, is it a good reason to not sow the seeds at all so that the animals cannot ruin the crop? But we should not outrightly condemn the Charvakas as immoral or unethical for upholding such crude views. For, as I told you earlier, that with time the Charvaka calmed down a bit with the emergence of the Sushikshita tradition among them. They relished the higher or the intellectual pleasures more in comparison to the base ones. It is believed that they even developed a fascination for the fine arts, and that they practiced 64 types of fine arts. Anyway, to conclude, I would like to say that Charvaka philosophy is quite straightforward. They believed only what they perceived and vociferously condemned the prevalent superstitions and ill practices in the society. They warned the common people against the trickeries of some selfish people. It was probably an ideological movement against those who, in the name of religion, were robbing innocent people not only of their wealth but also of their dignity. But we know that materialism and spiritualism are forces or tendencies, each pulling men towards itself. It is easier to get swayed by the materialistic forces or tendencies. But we can also not deny that man is essentially spiritual. And I am reminded of that story from the Kathopanishad which I discussed earlier in the lecture on the philosophy in the Upanishads. I will narrate it again. Yama asked Nachiketa to make 3 wishes so that he could retrieve his virtues and luck. In answer to this, Nachiketa made the first wish, in which he asked for his father's peace of mind. In his second wish, Nachiketa asked Yama about that sacrifice by performing which humans could attain heaven. Both the wishes were granted by Yama. Now, in the third wish, Nachiketa wanted to know from Yama about the mystery of death. Yama did not want to answer, for these were difficult spiritual matters. So, he dissuaded Nachiketa by giving him various kinds of temptations. He agreed to give him all the joys of life, kingdom, wealth, all sorts of sources of pleasure. But when Yama realized the unrelenting attitude and steadfastness of the spiritual seeker in Nachiketa, he instructed him about the mystery of death. And thus the supremacy of spiritualism and over materialism was established. Thank you so much.